You've been doing this Warhammer thing for a little while, or perhaps a long time. And one of the things that you notice as a player, as an enthusiast, love the game. As for Games Workshop, well, a love-hate relationship would be a nice way to describe it. Many players have issues with Games Workshop, and the frustration is, of course, with such an amazing game, the Warhammer narrative, whether it's Age of Sigmar or 40K, with such rich lore and an amazing community, how can the company run things this way? How can they literally every single turn and move they make go against their customer base? And in terms of war games, role-playing games, board games, Games Workshop is kind of a unique organization, a unique corporation, a unique gaming entity in itself that defies logic, defies many, many things. The challenge here I have noticed, being a long-time Warhammer 40,000 enthusiast, player, honored community member, focusing on, recently, of course, Grey Knights and Necrons, is we have such an amazing player base. And the first thing that happens is separating the player base from Games Workshop itself. Once you're able to disengage those two, it becomes a little bit easier to navigate, or at least a little more forgiving. The challenge here, in my opinion, is this, that builds this sense of feeling towards Games Workshop. 40K is a multi-layered game. What I mean by that is you collect and build and paint your army to various levels, various hobby levels. The customization, the detail, the lore, the narrative, that's one aspect of the game. Then playing the physical tabletop. But then even beyond that, acquiring new units, adding units to your army, thinking of different combinations. It's almost like this duality of you're able to physically play 40K, but even when you're not playing 40K, thinking about your army, designing your army, collecting and building. The challenge here, of course, is the armies being central to the Warhammer experience. It is a tabletop war game. The way Games Workshop pushes out new miniatures, new models, makes everything exclusive, everything FOMO. If you miss out now, then you miss out completely. The fact that there is no game balance whatsoever or attempt to it at different points of different editions, it's been a little bit better here and there, but there are numerous units across army factions that are just terabad. There are numerous units that one moment Games Workshop is pushing that model, and then the next moment they're not. Now, the old argument in previous editions was, look, and I agree with this to an extent, just look at Warhammer 40,000. Multiple armies across the spectrum of the game. And within those armies, multiple units, which makes sense. Games Workshop has always said they're not a gaming company, despite being called Games Workshop. They are a model company. So the more models they put out, the more units, the greater the profit. Trying to internally balance those units, I acknowledge, yes, there is a lot to balance. There is a lot to explore. And I'm not saying all units should be equal. There should be hardcore units. There should be elite units. There should be some units that would just destroy other units across multiple editions. But they should come at a high price. They should come at a limitation. They should not be able to just set up. It's almost like some armies you set up, walk away and come back in an hour, and the army played itself and won. That leads to frustration because there's a difference looking at other war games, hex-based war games or counter-based war games. I've played many titles over the years, and there have been some war games where, yes, the balance was out of whack significantly. Not as bad as 40K, but significantly. But that was just a tabletop hex-based counter war game. As soon as you start sinking, and this is what drives people to kind of really get mad at Games Workshop, is the fact that you invest all this physical life force and time into your army, and there's no regard for it with Games Workshop. It's just sell you the models, sell you some new models, switch things up. When you play a tabletop game, If you make poor tactica choices, and I've been there, tabletop glory, if there's a chance to earn tabletop glory, if there's a chance to sweep you and take you in an assault, never tell me the odds, I'm going to go for it. But when I do that with the knowledge of I'm trying to get tabletop glory. If it fails, that's on me. There have been times at tournaments and competitive play for 40K where I've been outmaneuvered. After the fact, caught in a trap, blown up, decimated, destroyed, cast down from the mighty top 5 tables into the late teens and 20s ranks. But I made a mistake. I could have seen that mistake. I didn't see that mistake. That's frustrating, yes, but that is acceptable ownership, and that is vastly different than, and I've played games like this, both casual and competitive 40K. I've set up my army against another army, and there's nothing I can do to beat it. It's just not going to happen. It's just not going to happen based on the design of the game. If we were talking prepackaged miniatures or counters, I could accept that. But given the time and effort that we put, the love into our armies, that's hard. The other aspect is, of course, you're connected to the game, the lore, the community, making friends, meeting friends, taking multiple model collections, having big battles. You want that feedback from Games Workshop. You want to know what's going on. You want to be included in social media. You want to see hobby aspects. Games Workshop gives nothing for free. They actively suppress community content. They actively suppress social media. They want to control everything. And from that player perspective, of course, now this is a much more nuanced setup. I understand you have to enforce, protect, control your IP. If we want to continue to get grimdark space marines, you have to control that. Going back a number of years to the dawn of time, the whole idea of Chapter House Studios, I can understand that. So I can understand partnering and working to protect your IP. But to the point where you suppress information or you offer nothing to the consumer other than, hey, here's what's coming out. You buy it now, or if you don't, you're never going to get it again. And even if you buy it now, and it's pretty good because we're trying to sell it, in the next life cycle of the game, which isn't even like 3 to 5 years, changing monthly, it might not even work. Now you're thinking, okay, I've got these models. What if they just sit on my shelf? What if they're not good? It's a constant feedback. So I find for that reason, what you see in much of the 40K community is the fact that we love the game. We love the players. We love the narrative. We love to build, paint, and collect. If Games Workshop would just make an effort, or just look to meet people halfway, or just put a little bit of balance into the game, these other aspects might become more manageable. But ultimately, not being a gaming company, Games Workshop should really be called Model Workshop. They're there to put out models. And the challenge here, of course, is once you buy those models, you have those models. So they need to come out with new models for you to buy. They need to shift models. They need to focus on selling, not playing, not balancing, not narrative. I understand that focus, but it breeds that duality. It breeds those feelings among its player base. And this is the end question before turning it over to the comments. And this has been a question for many years. Players have been sitting on the sidelines asking this question for many years, especially years ago when X-Wing Miniatures 1.0 rolled out. And for a short time there, when you looked at the report, here's the top 5 war games in terms of volume, in terms of players. Warhammer 40K was always number 1. But X-Wing Miniatures going on the list higher. At one point, it was number 3 or number 2. Games Workshop had to take notice. They had to stop that immediately. And one of the ways they did that was to internally cripple Fantasy Flight Games. Fantasy Flight dealing with their own Terranoth and universe, their in-house fantasy universe, but also aggressively pushing Star Wars and X-Wing Miniatures, a pre-painted miniature game. Games Workshop having the various licenses for their 40K titles, board games, Talisman, Relic, through Fantasy Flight, pulling those away, literally pulling that revenue stream away, which forced Fantasy Flight to accelerate to X-Wing 2.0 change up their titles and ultimately dethroned and put GW back to that number one spot. In exploring that, people have been saying for a long time, how long can Games Workshop continue to gain new customers? Once you bought into 40K and you have your first and second army, you're no longer the target audience. You're just not. That doesn't affect your enjoyment of the game. That doesn't affect the community. That doesn't affect what we can play together, what we can create together. Put 3D printing aside for a moment. Custom models aside for a moment. You're no longer GW's target audience. The turn and burn. How long can they do that? People have been predicting that collapse for years. For years. I had to buy a friend of mine a Titan because I made a bet years ago that, look, Games Workshop can't continue to burn its customer base like that. Well, apparently they can. Apparently there is an influx of new players. And I suspect much of that influx is through their starter set games and their other IPs pulling in digital properties leading into 40K. But it is interesting, and I'll leave you with this in the comments. 40K is a mass-scale combat game. Age of Sigmar is a mass-scale combat game where we're putting down dozens of tanks, hundreds and hundreds of one-to-one scale miniatures, meaning one figure represents one figure. It's not like DBA or DBN Romans or playing my Napoleonics where I've got four horses on a stand and that represents a unit. No, everything's one-to-one in these games. Now we're seeing the shift to skirmish. Smaller models, smaller games, maintaining that. The curve of 40K has flattened, but the new players continue to pour in. When and if will that reverse? That is the question.